Hello, global gardeners. Welcome to another wonderful Monday where we get to talk gardening for an hour and a half. That's a great way that I like to start my week. It's good to have everybody here as we talk about microclimates today. Of course, we'll be answering all the gardening questions that I can, but the focus is on microclimates, what they mean, and more importantly, how you can use them and create them within your own garden. Now, I have done a video about this topic in the past, and I actually have that link in the description below if you want to check that out. But today we're going to do it live while we have everybody here. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone who likes to celebrate Valentine's Day, February 14th. And happy day after Super Bowl in the United States to everybody that focused on that yesterday. So let's get into gardening right away. I saw some question or a question and lots of comments going back and forth about ants in the house, and some really good information, good suggestions. Diatomaceous earth was an option, apparently didn't work. And that is one of those things that outside, particularly around the actual ant hill, diatomaceous earth can have some benefits, but in the house, it's not as effective. Instead, what tends to be most effective in the house, as was suggested, was something like borax or something as simple as vinegar. So if you see where the ants are actually walking across your countertop or the floor, they're traveling that path based on the chemicals that previous ants have laid down. And then they have receptors to pick up those chemicals, and it's basically like lights on the side of the road leading them to wherever the food is. So if you can disrupt those chemicals by putting something as simple as vinegar down, that's often enough to at least divert them to another area. And it'll help you identify where the ants are coming in the first place when you can see that line. So blocking up any of the holes that they're getting in, disrupting their paths, and potentially diatomaceous earth are typically the best ways to do it. So good luck with that. Hope that actually works. Chris says look for a wet area if you have ants in the house. Another good point. The ants are they need water just like any other insect or animal. And typically where you have water, you're going to have a hole, and it's also going to be very enticing, that nice moist environment. So yeah, that's also a way to try to find out where they're coming in. Mage Grey Wolf says, I've used vinegar in my bathrooms with success when it comes to ants. There you have it. So hopefully that helps. Today, as we talk about microclimates, I'll start right off by pointing out my backyard is the picture behind me today. And some of this looks familiar to you, I'm sure. But I have a lot of microclimates within my backyard. And as we'll discuss, I've created a number of microclimates within my backyard as well. So this is my background, and I'll be talking about this as we proceed through the show. And let's see what else we have. Llama Llama is saying, my husband did it again just when I thought I had my garden plan. He got me a Baker Creek gift certificate. The struggle is real. That's funny. So you got to get seeds from Baker Creek. So I'll mention this as well. Next week, I have a special show. It's going to be my 100th live stream. I have a special guest that'll be appearing on that show. And then the following week, 2 weeks from now, so on February 28th, I will not be live because I'm taking a road trip, and one of the places I'm going to visit is Baker Creek Seeds. And I've been working with them. I'll be getting a tour of their greenhouses and talking to a lot of their staff, doing a lot of filming, as you might expect, to put out some videos about it. But in 2 weeks, I won't be here because I'll be going to Baker Creek. I'll also be going to the Greenstock factory and talking to the inventor and the family and the staff of the wonderful Greenstock vertical garden system. So that's where I'm going to be in a couple weeks. And actually today on Valentine's Day, Greenstock is having a pretty good sale on the Greenstock leaf tower, which I did a video about this last year. It's a new tower. The 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 actual pockets are a little shallower, and so you can actually fit more levels in the same amount of space compared to the original green stock. They're on sale today, like 40% off. So if that's something you might be interested in, check out the link I have below in the description. But I'm going to be visiting them in a couple weeks, and you'll get to see all that when I put together the video for both Baker Creek and also for Greenstock. And I'm hoping to do this in the future as well. The Botanical Interest is just up the road from me, and so I'm going to try to set that up as well, going to visit Botanical Interest, seeing their operation, doing a video about it. True Leaf Market is in Utah, which is just the next state over. I've also been talking with them in the past, and next time I go to Utah, I'll be dropping by and seeing them. So I know we all have our favorite seed companies, and I've got a ton. I'm trying to make an effort to actually go to a lot of these seed companies to give you some of the behind the scenes look at what they're doing and how they do it, and also meet some of the people on the staff. So look for that in the weeks ahead. Just want to make sure I give you a heads up so you don't show up in 2 weeks and wonder where I am. But I'll definitely be here in a week. And there's Jay on top of things. Yeah, if you do the Greenstock Vertical Garden System, use the code Gardener Scott at checkout for a $10 discount. So if you are getting like the big leaf system at 40% off, and then you get an additional discount, oh man, it's a bargain. And so I've got 2, and like most of you who have the Greenstock, that's often not enough. So I'm actually thinking of getting another one this year as well. So thanks for that, Jay. Let's see. Mage Grey Wolf is saying, an idea for your purple garden. How about borage? So yeah, so the video that I just did this weekend was talking about choosing something for your garden to make it challenging. And the challenge I put forth was choose a color. And I chose purple to actually put a number of different plants in the same bed. So right now, my purple bed plan has 10 different plants in that bed, all of them purple. Either purple fruit, the purple roots, but the plants are purple. And borage is actually a good one. I actually grew borage just over my shoulder right here. I had borage right here last year. It's a wonderful plant for attracting beneficial insects. And so, yeah, that's actually a really good idea. If you take up that challenge, if you do that plan with the idea being that the whole bed will be a single color. Oh, there's Mala popping in to say hello. If you do that, I know she wants me to go outside now. If you do that single color idea in your garden, you don't have to limit it to vegetables and fruit and roots. Go ahead and put in some of those other plants in the bed that match. So yeah, borage would be a great idea in a purple garden bed. Not only can you eat it, but also because it does something like attract the beneficials. And so also in a purple bed, you might want to do something like violets, because violets, you can actually eat the flowers, and it's also beneficial for the insects coming in. So that's kind of an addendum to that video I did, is to think beyond just the typical vegetables and start growing some of those other things. So great suggestion. I think borage would actually be a really good idea to do something like that. And kale, there are decorative kales. There are lots of plants depending on whatever color you choose. I just think it'd be a lot of fun to do something like that. I enjoy it, and I think you all could enjoy it too if you try to do something along those lines. So Brian says, started some borage and did that from saved seeds. That's awesome. I let my borage go to seed and then just let the seeds fall. So I'm anticipating a lot more borage in that area as it naturalizes and becomes part of the garden bed just over my shoulder. So I see Scott Head checking in. Nice to have you here, Scott. Scott Head from the Black Gumbo channel. You hear me talk about that all the time. Great channel. Scott's already actively growing and into the single seed challenge. So definitely check that out. If you haven't started the single seed challenge, it's something you should definitely think about. Janan says, the purple video made me want to research for next year doing a rainbow in my garden, each bed color coded. This year I think I might try a white bed. That's a fantastic idea. And there's really no reason why you can't do it. White is a wonderful color to use. And actually, over in this area of my garden back here, I'm planning on constructing just a really low and small fence, not to separate anything, but to actually create a microclimate. And in this area is actually where I'm planning to do a white garden. Now that's my pollinator garden and my cutting garden, and so I'll be growing primarily flowers. But you can do that throughout your garden. Choose a color and grow that color in a bed, grow that color in a particular section of the garden. And the idea of doing a rainbow is actually quite creative. So thank you for that suggestion. I think that could be an awful lot of fun. So let's go ahead and jump into the microclimate idea, since now you're picturing this area and trying to figure out how that's going to work. So when we talk about climate around the planet, it covers a wide area. And so within the United States, a very large country on this continent, there are numerous climates. And they range from the desert Southwest, where it's hot and it's dry, all the way up to the frozen North, where it's cold and dry in many situations. And so as we look at our climate, we should all be aware of the general patterns that we have in our area. And climate is determined over a long period of time. It's decades of climatological data that officially figure out what your climate is. And that's opposed to weather. Now, my climate is hot and dry, but we get rainy days. So those single days of rain, or those single days of thunderstorms, or those single days with big snowfall, they don't really change the climate. They're a short-term effect of the weather conditions in our particular area. And so when you think of the idea behind a climate, the general weather patterns, the general temperature, the general humidity, all over a large area, you probably have a pretty good idea of what your climate is. In the Pacific Northwest, it tends to be very wet and cool. That's the climate. Well, as we look at our garden, we have the general climate that can be defined or acknowledged by a government agency, and we look at it, and I know I live in a very dry region. We get snow every winter, and we get heat every summer, and then we get specific weather patterns in between. In our individual gardens, that climate has an effect on your plants and your trees. And the hardiness zones tend to play into that idea. So I'm in zone 5B. 5B means that my average lowest temperature in winter is minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 26 degrees Celsius, and that stays pretty consistent. That happens over time. But as far as the microclimates are concerned, there are areas in my garden that never reach minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit. For instance, this greenhouse. A greenhouse, once you get it up and running, and once you especially if you're doing additional heating, you're creating a microclimate. You're creating an entire different set of climate factors for the plants that you might be growing in a greenhouse. And so while I'll have snow outside the greenhouse, I'll never have snow inside the greenhouse. So those are the kind of things that you can think of in the garden as far as the big things you can do to affect what plants you can grow and how you grow those plants. A greenhouse is right at the top of the list. But a microclimate can actually be as small as a single rock, because rock can absorb and reflect the sun's radiation and the heat of the day. And so this is a great time of year, and this is why I wanted to talk about microclimates today, because it holds true for both the winter and the summer, but particularly the winter. Start looking at the areas of your garden where the snow melts first. And you'll probably recognize that if you have a big rock in your garden, that's where the snow is melting before any other place in your garden. Sidewalks and driveways made out of concrete, the snow is typically going to start melting around those areas before it melts in other larger areas of your landscape, because that concrete and the way it absorbs the heat during the day, it is effectively a microclimate. It's a very small patch. It may be, like I said, just a single rock, only a few square feet of space, but that little bit of difference may influence how your plants grow. And as you look at your larger garden and your larger landscape, you begin to see patterns. So that's why I say start looking at just the single rock, and you can see those patterns now around your house. A wall in the northern hemisphere that faces south, a south-facing wall, is getting the full brunt of the sun during the day, reflecting some of that sun, and that's also going to be a place where the snow melts first. That is a microclimate. That area is completely different from other areas of your landscape. Those areas that are underneath trees is completely different than the areas that are outside the trees. And so for those of us that live in regions like this, you can see this is a really cold day behind me, but the skies are completely blue, no clouds in the sky. Well, what we know for those of us that live in an area like this is as the weather moves through, if we get a snowfall and the next day is cloudy, it could be a very warm day. But if the next day has no clouds, it's going to be a very cold day, because the clouds help hold in any of the heat that has developed in our area. Without those clouds, especially with the snow, all of the heat escapes into the atmosphere. Well, trees work the same way in your landscape. On cold days, as the heat begins to rise from the ground and try to escape into the atmosphere, if you have a lot of trees, especially with low branches, those branches now act like clouds, and they help hold the heat closer to the ground. So don't be surprised if you start doing some of this checking and evaluating and investigating and find out that in winter in particular, the areas underneath your trees are warmer than some of the areas outside the tree. You definitely know in the summer that the trees are shading the ground, and so the area underneath the trees are cooler than the other areas in the summer. This is what microclimates are all about. It's recognizing the differences within your own landscape, and then using your gardening skills, choosing the plants and the location of the plants to take full advantage of those skills. So there's the beginning of it. We'll talk more specifics as we roll along. Let me see what we have in the way of questions. John Anakin is saying it's been a real learning curve finding the microclimates in my garden over the last few years. This year I'm trying to utilize them. Good for you. And so I'm doing the same thing. My shed, I've got a pretty big garden shed near my garden. Same thing. The wall that faces south, that whole area the snow's already melted. It melts right away. It's very hot. And so for me, because of that, if I just provide a little bit of protection on any plants I put in that area, I can effectively grow plants of a higher zone. So I'm in zone 5. I should be able to grow zone 6 plants in that area right next to my shed, because the soil is warmer. It doesn't get as cold in the winter, and that's a microclimate that I can use to my benefit to grow plants. The opposite holds true. The north side of my shed doesn't get sunlight until the peak of summer, and even then for only a couple weeks. So it pretty much stays in the shade year round. It's the last spot that snow melts in spring. I can use that to my benefit to grow plants that need shade, that don't like a lot of sun. That's a microclimate that could give me the opportunity to grow plants that I can't grow any place else in my garden, because my garden is completely open to sunlight. I can't grow any shade-loving plants, except maybe in that one area because the shed blocks the sunlight. And so walls do this, fences do this, even plants that you put in with the intention of blocking sunlight, well, you're now creating a microclimate by putting plants in to create two different types of weather between the north side and the south side. And so the plants, when you think about companion planting, the plants that you put in on either side of a hedge are going to be different based on what the sun does and how warm the soil is and what the microclimate is on each side of that hedge. So a lot of cool stuff, a lot of fun things that you can really start looking. And you're right, it can be difficult figuring it out, but it is the kind of thing you should start looking for and start thinking about the differences. I have a video, the video I link below, I think I mentioned it in that video. I had a line of plants at a previous house. I thought the conditions were identical. Same soil and the same watering. It looked like, to me, as a newer garden or gardener, that the plants were all going to grow the same, but they didn't. And as I started doing the analysis of why the plants on one end of this little hedge that I had constructed of plants, why the plants on one end were smaller and not as healthy, and why the ones on the complete opposite end were just doing great, was because of shade. Just enough shade at the critical times of year that the plants on the end that weren't doing well, they didn't get a lot of sun in spring, and they didn't get a lot of sun in autumn. They got full sun in summer, which is when I put the plants in. But during the other times of year, they weren't getting the sun for the growth, and so they were stunted. It's as simple as that. A fence can make a big difference when you take into account how the sun is shining, or in that case, how the shade is actually covering plants that need the sun. Yankee Sister, great to have you back on Monday. Always nice to see you. Got to start mapping out those microclimates. Yep, absolutely, good idea. Found a perfect south spot for jug winter sowing. Good idea. Take care. You take care as well. Yeah, really good idea. As we talk about winter sowing, which I did a video about this time last year, a lot of other videos out there, a lot of interest in the winter sowing. I actually did it over here, but I have a tree stump that I put in. I cut it off of the tree that I cut down in my front yard. It's just a log that I put vertically in my garden in this space right here, and it's a microclimate. I put it there specifically to create a microclimate with full sun on the one side and shade on the back side. And if you look at that video on my winter sowing, that's where I did my winter sowing. It's because of that little microclimate that I created around that tree stump. And it's just enough to make a difference sometimes when you're sowing your seed. So good luck with that, Yankee Sister. I know you'll have fun, but that's a good idea. I've talked about sun mapping before, where you map your sun and your shade patterns within your garden. Great idea to go ahead and map out the microclimates. And most of us recognize that we have an area in our yard that is warmer or colder, or some other issue that we have. It's a little bit higher, so it gets more wind. It's a little bit lower, so it gets more water. There are lots of those kind of things that we'll recognize, but I really like the idea of actually mapping it, because when you come to plan your garden, you can look at your map and go, oh yeah, I forgot that area of the yard is always a little bit warmer. That's where I'm going to put in my okra or whatever plant you're wanting to grow. And I've recognized that within my own vegetable garden, that the bed, my concrete block bed that's right next to my metal bed, the reflection of the sun off of that metal is enough to warm up that concrete block bed warmer than any of the other areas of my garden. It's not the materials that I use to construct the bed that makes the soil warmer. It's the fact that at the end of the day, that bed just has gotten more sunlight, more direct sunlight and more reflective light. And so some of the plants I've put in there in the last couple of years have really struggled. And it took me a while to figure out that that's a microclimate from one bed to the next bed in my garden. And so now the plants I'll be growing in that bed are the ones that can handle some sustained heat and light. And among them are okra plants that I'm hoping to grow this year. So you see Mala's tail going back and forth. She wants to see what I'm doing today. She's been quite needy today, but that's, I think, because we haven't been going out as often as possible. You can see her footprints in the snow on this particular morning. So she's saying hi in the background. I hope that's not too distracting for you. Okay, let's see what we have in 4B1K1. I learned so many terms for some of the things I do here. I'm moving, and every time I visit my new place, I've been looking at sun, shade, lingering snow patches, etc. to plan where I want to plant. Exactly. That's exactly the point of it, is to start observing and recognizing those kind of patterns, especially in a new house. And that's why I always recommend take as long as you possibly can at a new place so that you can choose the best spots of the sun and the shade and everything else. And so when we talk about microclimates, and if you look up microclimates online, generally you're going to see the larger term for microclimates. And so generally, from a climate perspective, the three things that are going to affect a region that creates a microclimate is the topography, mountains, hills, lakes, and then associated with that lakes, a second factor tends to be water. Large bodies of water will create microclimates, and then the other one is trees, forests, and or lack of trees when you tie that in with the topography as well. And then something relatively recently, oh, sorry, she's chewing on something I can't let her chew on. Something relatively recently is the idea of a city, the urban structure that actually can create microclimates. And so we see this here in the United States, particularly in an area like Phoenix, Arizona, that is just grown so big in recent years and has so much of asphalt and concrete and buildings that the temperature has risen over the city of Phoenix over recent years because of that urban heat effect. So those are microclimates. In the United States, again, the Great Lakes create some expansive microclimates. Buffalo, New York, for instance, by the Great Lakes, gets a huge amount of snow that other cities that are relatively nearby don't get. It's because of the lake effect. And so on that larger scale, when we talk about big microclimates, we'll talk about the Great Lakes, we'll talk about the urban effect, we'll talk about forests and deserts. But those same effects take place within your own garden. And so hot air rises and cold air sinks. If you've got a garden on a hillside, the bottom of the garden that's downhill, the soil will be cooler than the soil that's at the top of the hill. And that means that you can grow, and really should grow, different plants in those different areas of your terraced garden because they're going to be different temperatures. The wind has an effect like that too. I live in a very windy area, and I have to take that into account. More tender plants need to be protected from the wind. And so I have to create a barrier, and that barrier creates a microclimate. Wind on one side, no wind on the other side. So same basic ideas that we have for some of these larger aspects. The lake effect, you can do the same thing by putting a pond in your garden. And particularly in the summer, the area around that pond is going to be cooler than the other areas of your garden, which will affect the plants that will thrive in that wet and cool area. So start looking at what you already have. Then you can start moving towards the building of the structures or creating an environment for plants that you can't currently grow, but by modifying your landscape and developing some of it into these microclimates, you might have the ability to grow some more stuff. So Mrs. V says, hi back at you. Still can't plant outside in Georgia. Still too cold. Yeah, most of us are still having a hard time getting outside. But still, this, that's tying it back into the microclimates. This is a perfect time, especially in Georgia, the southern states of the United States. Look for those areas that are thawing out first, and you might be able to put a cold frame or a bed with a hoop on it and get planting earlier than you would otherwise. A hoop with plastic over it creates a microclimate for that bed, just like a greenhouse does. And so you might not be able to do typical gardening like you're used to, where you have your open beds and you put your seeds in and you start growing. But by creating that environment 2 weeks early or 3 weeks earlier than normal, you might be able to get some seeds in the ground, might be able to get some plants in because you've created that microclimate. So, okay, let's see what else we have. Carla says that her yard looks like my picture today. There's still a lot of snow. We got more snow coming. I'm hoping the snow lays off here in a couple weeks for my trip. It'll be a road trip from Colorado to Missouri. That's where Baker Creek Seed is. And then to Tennessee. That's where the green stock factory is. And so I'm hoping that our snow patterns actually lay off a little bit here, at least while I'm on my trip. So wish me luck for that. Tammy says, the climate of our yard changed in a huge way when the storm took out more than half the trees in the city and 4 trees in our yard. We are so much windier and so much less shade. It is hotter now. There you go. That's microclimates in action. And so now that you've recognized that, you can use it to your benefit. Maybe some plants you hadn't thought about growing before are now going to be ideally suited for an area with fewer trees and more wind and more heat. So, or some of those other plants that you're growing and they're beginning to suffer. And I mentioned the hedge. If you have plants that you're doing everything right, you're putting the plant in, you're taking care of it, your soil is good, and the plant just doesn't grow, it could be because there's a microclimate there that you haven't recognized yet. And it could be the heat, it could be the humidity, it could be a number of these weather factors that we can develop some control over. But add that to your analysis. When plants die, it's often more than how much water they're getting and how much fertilizer they're getting and how much care they're getting. Sometimes it's about the microclimate or that specific little weather that the plant is getting in that couple square feet of your garden. And adding that into your analysis may open your eyes as to some of the things you can do to improve your gardening. Okay, let's see. Thank you, Urban Chicken Mama. Yeah, I appreciate that. If you're getting some benefit from this, give me the thumbs up. That's one of those things that tells YouTube that I guess I'm worth keeping around for a little bit longer. Chris says, southern Wisconsin is in a drought, 15 inches below normal snowfall. Last year we started drought with some precipitation deficit. Yeah, absolutely. We're in a drought as well. We didn't get snow until New Year's. And normally we would get snow in October and November and December. We got 0 snow until the beginning of this year. So we're way behind as well. And this also, so right now, the droughts and some of the changes in the weather patterns may not be enough to actually officially change the climate within our own particular garden. So do expect, as the weather patterns change and as they update climatological data, that in some regions the official climate will change from what it has been. But whether it's official or not, if you start recognizing within your own area that things are different, do things differently. And so a drought may be one of those temporary microclimate kind of situations. So as we talk about microclimates, they're not necessarily permanent. It's something that may be just a fleeting change in your garden, something that might only happen for a couple weeks or a couple months, or maybe you can build a structure that will impact your garden for years to come. But when some of these weather patterns change and we get less rain and the droughts develop, think in terms of a microclimate, because the normal rain that might be part of your climate doesn't come, and so you're going to have modifications in your garden as a result of that. So that's a good point as we move forward. Some regions are getting more rain, some regions are getting less rain, and that affects how we garden. Melissa's saying coastal gardens northwest, then I would treat it. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking a question. You were responding to coastal gardens northwest. Let's go ahead and move down to Mama Preps 4. I'm in southwest Montana, and we already have green grass coming up. The spinach under the snow survived. It was 56 degrees yesterday. That's about 13 degrees Celsius. This is very unusual for where I live. And that's a weather change. Over a period of time, it could be a climate change, but definitely start looking at those kind of things, because if you recognize in Montana that grass is growing when it gets warm at this time of year, that's a kind of situation where you can use that to your advantage for growing other plants like the spinach and other plants that can handle the cold. Kale, if you can create a microclimate where it doesn't get as cold as normal, you should be able to grow spinach and kale in particular throughout the winter. And it could be hoops, it could be a cold frame, it could be a reflecting wall. But that's a good observation, because that's one of those things when you start seeing what's happening naturally, it now means that if you copy what nature is doing, you can create it artificially in a different area of your garden. And that's what microclimates are all about. And as far as I think in terms of gardening, is recognizing it, but then actually understanding how you can use them and create those microclimates within your garden. If you'd like to grow some heat-loving plants, put in a lot of rock. Do the same thing that is happening in Phoenix right now. Have a really rocky area of your garden, and you might be able to grow some heat-loving plants in that area that you wouldn't be able to grow otherwise. So, Raphaelia, thank you so much. Happy Valentine's Day back to you. I appreciate that. That's very nice. And so Coastal Gardens is saying it's carrots I'm wanting to grow. And so that turns it around to the other side. I've been talking about the heat-loving, creating some of these heat things. There's a lot of plants, like carrots, for instance. A lot of us who grew carrots this last year had a problem with the carrots bolting. No, carrots are a biennial plant. And so normally they'll grow in the first season. You leave them in the ground over winter, and then in the second season, they'll send up their flower stalk and develop their seeds. But even with biennial plants, most plants, when they're overly stressed, they're going to send up their flower stalk and their seeds. And so a lot of us that were growing carrots this last year didn't have good success because it just got too hot too fast. And our carrots were flowering in the first season. which means that carrot is not putting the energy into the root, it's putting the energy into the flowers. And so a lot of people that grew carrots this last year had very small carrots and flower stalks. One of the things you can do is shade your carrots in the summertime to create a cooler area and less sunlight underneath the shade cloth. You've created a microclimate so that the carrots can grow through the summer and not send up that flower stalk and still develop a big root. So it's not always about creating that warmth for an extra zone that we could grow in. Sometimes it's creating a cooler environment because our weather patterns are getting so much hotter. And so carrots have a good, rich, loose soil. They like growing in cooler conditions, and then recognize in the summer it might not be cool enough for the carrots. So create that cooler environment with a shade cloth, and the carrots will typically do better because you stepped in and created a microclimate for them. So let's see what else we have. TJ the Hawk says, I planted carrots around my tomatoes during the summertime, and this kept them cool, and I got a great harvest. Great idea. The idea of companion planting, where you use the bigger plants to shade and cool the area around them. So great idea. Carrots and tomatoes, any larger plant that can shade the younger plant, it's good. And so when I've talked about this a couple times in the past, we often plan our garden with the assumption that we always put the taller plants in the back of the bed so that they don't shade out the plants in the front, because the assumption is that all of our plants need full sun. So we put short plants in the front and tall plants in the back, and they'll all be happy. But that's not the case. Some plants don't do as well in that full sun situation. And so this last year I did that with one of my beds, where I had the tomatoes growing in the middle of the bed, and I had sun-loving basil on the front of the bed, and then I was growing some other plants on the back of the bed, flowers that didn't need as much sun and actually benefited from that extra little bit of shade. So absolutely great idea to be able to companion plant and create that microclimate with plants. I mean, that's about as easy as it gets. Okay. Karen's saying, I've left well mulched a few beets and carrots, seeing if they will give me seed. What do you think? There's about 2.5 to 3 feet of snow covering. Yeah, they should do fine. They'll, especially underneath the snow. Snow is a fantastic insulator. And so the temperature of the snow is 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 degrees Celsius, which means the soil temperature right underneath the snow is pretty much going to be that temperature, which is a great temperature for overwintering beets and carrots. And so when that snow melts, you should see those plants start to grow again. And in this year, this second season, you should expect to see some flower stalks and seeds develop. So that's a great idea. Mulching it and then using the snow as an insulator, that's exactly what you do when you want to grow biennial plants and then save the seed. And years ago at the Galileo Garden, I did that with carrots, an entire bed of carrots one year, left in the ground, lots of snow, lots of cold. They all came back, and we had thousands upon thousands upon thousands of carrot seeds in that second year with no effort, just leaving them in the ground. So yeah, I think, Karen, your plants will recover fine, and you'll probably have some really good growth, and I hope you get some really good seeds this year as the season gets warm and we can actually start growing things hopefully soon. Samantha's saying, my issue has been sun-loving plants get leggy in the spring because of low sun, and my partial shade flowers then fry in the summer. Yeah, so you're already starting to recognize the idea behind it. And so especially for your sun-loving plants, if you have an area that you can put those plants in that are an area that is very close to that wall or nearby, you're going to get the reflective light. And so some of the plants that get leggy in the spring because they don't get enough light, if you move them to an area where they're getting the natural low intensity of light, but that's amplified because they're getting the reflective light off of a wall, those plants shouldn't be as leggy anymore. And then the opposite holds true for the shade-loving plants. If they're not doing well because of full sun, we'll put another plant in, put a little fence in, put a hedge in, something to help block some of that light, and they should do better. But so start thinking about that, Samantha, as you move forward, what you can do to modify the little, and you don't need to do this throughout your whole landscape. We're talking microclimates. We're talking about very small sections. You might only need to put one plant in, and that's enough. As I was putting in, so over in this area, just around the corner of my landscape, I put in some new plants this last year, some fruiting bushes like gooseberries and honeyberries. And some of the plants that I put in were actually pretty small plants. And we had a weird year last year where it was really, really cold and then suddenly it was hot. And so when I put those plants in, the weather was very hot and very dry for the first few weeks after I put those plants in. All I did was to take a 5-gallon bucket and just put it in front of those plants and created a microclimate so that they got the morning sun. That bucket blocked those plants from getting fried in the afternoon sun, and then they got the late afternoon sun. And so the plants took off and started to grow, and then once they became stronger, I just moved the 5-gallon buckets out of the way, and now they were getting full sun throughout the day. So sometimes it's just that simple. One thing for one plant creates a microclimate and can maybe give you the benefit of the plant not being leggy or stronger or more successful because you've just changed one little thing around that one plant. You don't have to do this throughout your garden. Jan Zeely saying, my backyard is basically a microclimate. The back and right is basically a 12-meter hill with high concrete walls on them. And my left side, the neighbor covered his fence with shade cloth. There you go. So that sounds like a perfect situation for creating microclimates. Now it's up to you to figure out the specific effects within your yard and figuring out what plants you would use or what plants you don't do or what plants have already been doing well because of something like a 12-meter hill and concrete walls. That I'm guessing, and so that's one of those things, that talking about the hot air rises. I'm guessing the area at the top of the hill next to that concrete wall is probably the hottest spot in your entire garden. And the area at the bottom of the hill is probably the coolest. And so this is one of those situations you would not be growing the same plants at the top and the bottom. And even though they might only be separated by a dozen meters, that's enough to totally create or change the environment around the specific plant. So that's a really good example. Urban Chicken Mama, so excited for my new green stock to arrive. Awesome. Glad you've got one. Trying to decide what to plant in it first. Want to be different than the normal strawberries, lettuce, or herb suggestions. Well, I would start off by suggesting the lettuce and the herbs. They're so easy to grow, and I think the green stock is ideally suited for that. And that's why I've got them right outside my back door, and I grow a lot of lettuce crops. I had great success growing spinach. I had great success growing basil. I had great success growing lettuce. So those for me are the easiest to grow. But you can also grow beans and peas. And if green stock also sells the little trellis. I don't know if you have the addition that you put around the green stock. You can grow bigger plants. You can grow tomatoes even and squash and just train them up that little trellis that goes outside the green stock. And I did a little bit of that last year growing beans, where I grew the beans in my green stock and just trained them up the green stock. So pretty much just about anything you grow in the open garden or in your garden beds, you can do in a green stock. You might need to modify it a little bit because of how big the roots might get on those specific plants. And so even though I've seen pictures and I know people grow tomatoes in the green stock, for me, I prefer growing tomatoes in a bed. I can trellis them, but it's doable. You can grow tomatoes in the green stock as well. So I would say start by figuring out what you want to grow and then make the next step to figure out, can you grow it in a green stock? And chances are you can. It's so easy to grow the lettuce and the herbs in particular that I just take the easy way out as far as my green stock is concerned. I pushed the limits a little bit last year. I did try growing some cucumbers, but then I was gone for a couple days and they didn't get watered and the plant kind of suffered, so I didn't have success. But if I'd been here and had taken care of it, I would have easily been able to grow the cucumbers in the green stock. So just spend a little bit of time thinking about your planning and what you want, and then figure out if you can do it in the green stock and how easy it is, because that's the other issue. How easy do you want your gardening to be? I always suggest stretching your limits and pushing yourself, but sometimes it's nice to be able to just walk out your back door and pluck off some lettuce and spinach and basil and go in and make a salad for dinner. And that's why I take the easy approach on a lot of that stuff. And Patricia says, I can't imagine my 7-foot beefsteak tomato plants in a vertical planter. And again, you can. And some of the green stock pictures I've seen have the green stock next to a wall or next to a trellis so that those plants can grow up the trellis. And it's doable if you take the extra step. But I agree with you. I'd rather grow a 7-foot tall tomato plant in a bed where I have a trellis that's specifically designed for that, and then save my green stock for some of those smaller plants that really thrive in a system like that. Okay, let's see. Urban Chicken Mama, you're responding to Nick from Yuma, so I'll let you do that. Eggnog Brownies is saying, I'm still torn on if I want to buy a green stock, even with the sale. Don't worry about it. You know, a green stock is like any other aspect of gardening. When you're ready for it, you're ready for it. I gardened for 30 years before I got a green stock, and then I think it was 2 years before I got my second green stock. So it's not something you have to do. It's just one of those things that if you're thinking about doing it, definitely take advantage of the sale. That's the benefit to the sale. But yeah, don't feel bad if you don't get a green stock this year. Absolutely no pressure. And maybe put it on your Christmas list for next year. Or they'll probably do a Valentine's Day sale next year. They have sales throughout the year as well. So let your family know that you want one and let them get it for you. Let them look for the sales. And when it comes, it comes. No one should feel bad if you don't have a greenhouse, if you don't have a green stock, if you don't have raised beds. Those are just extras that some of us are doing. If all you've got is a little plot in the backyard and you're happy growing plants in it, go for it. Do that and don't feel like you need any of these extra things until you're ready. And then you can definitely have fun with it. Dwayne is wondering, what types of berries can you grow in containers? So you can actually grow quite a bit. So blueberries, I think, should be pretty much at the top of the list because many of us do not have the soil pH low enough to grow blueberries. Even in the United States, there's only a small section of the country where the natural soil can support the growth of blueberries. So to be able to grow blueberries and a lot of other plants that require a specific pH, you grow them in a container where you can create the soil environment and the pH for that plant and then grow those plants. And so that's what I'm doing this year with blueberries. For the first time in this garden, I'm growing blueberries and I'm growing in containers because I can manage that. Strawberries are ideal for growing in containers, and that's one of those that that I think a lot of people do, and because it's a really good idea. And then you can expand depending on the size of the container. You can grow gooseberries and currants and honeyberries and all those type of bushing and shrubbing fruits. You could even do blackberries and raspberries, assuming that your container is suitable for either putting a trellis in the container or putting the container next to a fence so that the blackberries can grow up it. Those are possibilities. I tend to think those kind of cane berries do better in the ground, but you can grow them in containers. So most of what we grow in the garden, to include trees, you can grow those in containers. You just have to make sure the container is big enough and that the soil in that container is appropriate for that plant, and then have fun with it. So I would say strawberries and blueberries are probably at the top of my list, but lots of other berry possibilities out there depending on what kind of berries you want to grow. Melissa says, I have 4 giant golden berries that overwintered. They hate perfect soil, so they're perfect in smaller containers, 5-gallon containers. So good. Thank you for that suggestion. Giant golden berries in 5-gallon buckets. And you can actually grow a lot of stuff in 5-gallon buckets. I mention this occasionally. A gardener that I met years ago, and his whole garden is 5-gallon buckets. His soil is bad. He lives near me. And so rather than try to create a garden like I am, where I'm working for years to create new soil and bringing in soil, he just decided to just forget all that work and just do a garden in 5-gallon buckets. And he's got squash, peppers, and tomatoes, and herbs, and everything else that the rest of us are growing in our gardens, he's growing in 5-gallon buckets. And yeah, there's no reason why you couldn't do a lot of the smaller fruit bushes and potentially even some fruit trees in containers like that as well. So Doris M. saying, jumping on a little late. Good morning to you. Thanks for taking the time, sharing all your wisdom. Well, thank you for that. I love doing this stuff, and I do it not so that I can necessarily just let you know everything I know. I'm doing this so that all of you can become better gardeners and hopefully someday reciprocate to others and share the knowledge and the wisdom and the gardening experience that you've gained. You share that with somebody else. Pass it on. And that's all I'm doing, is just passing on things that I've learned over the years from other gardeners and from my own experience. So thank you for saying that. But I love doing this. This is just one of those things that it's so much fun to get together every Monday and do this. Except for those of you that might be coming on late, I won't be here in 2 weeks. So on February 28th, I'm going to be on the road and won't be here, but I'll be back the week after that. And I'll tell you all about the trip to Baker Creek and the trip to the Greenstock. And I think that should be a lot of fun. Great people that I've worked with at both those companies so far as we're communicating back and forth. Once I expressed interest in wanting to visit, they were extremely supportive and really helping me out to make it a good trip. So that's why I want to make some videos to show you some of the behind the scenes stuff that maybe just the person that stops in to buy some seeds wouldn't necessarily see. So I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. Bobby Wilson saying, I grow flowers, greens, peas, beans, peppers, and much more in 5-gallon buckets. Everything does well. Thank you for that. Thank you for giving that little bit of information that, yes, it does work. There you have it. It's not just me that says it works. Bobby's saying it works too, and it really does. It's one of those things that it's so easy. Now, granted, the soil in a container may need more attention than the soil in your open garden because the plants are going to be using the nutrients. You can reuse the potting soil. You can reuse that container soil every year. You just may need to give it a little bit more attention to make sure you're adding back more compost and more nutrients. And so I typically don't do fertilizer much at all in my open garden because I'm amending the soil. But in containers, I fertilize because I recognize that there's usually a nitrogen or a nutrient deficiency, often nitrogen, when you're growing in a container. Okay. So I appreciate that, Llama. Yeah, it's actually fun as I'm starting to figure out what videos I'm going to do, and so I'm hoping, or at least planning. We'll see how it all turns out. I'm planning to do a video about the Baker Creek operation, their greenhouses, and they're expanding dramatically. So I'm hoping to do a video on really nothing more than their greenhouses, and depending on who is walking through the greenhouses with me, it may be the greenhouse manager. I'll be asking questions, and we'll be doing that, and that'll be one video, so you can just see how a company like Baker Creek Heirloom Seeds that sends out hundreds of thousands of seed packets every year, how they go about doing it. And I know they used to do a lot of open fields, and so what I've been learning is they're doing a lot more in greenhouses as they're growing the plants to collect the seeds. So there's a video right there. And then I'm hoping to actually sit down with the owner of Baker Creek and talk a little bit about his story, because he was just a kid that started saving seeds and became a gardener at a very young age, and that developed into one of the biggest and most popular seed companies in the United States. So I'd love to have a video just dedicated on him. And then I want to do a video of just walking through the Baker Creek store in Missouri, because they've got all of their seeds laid out in the store. So, I mean, how crazy is that going to be? So, yeah, I'm actually looking forward to those videos too, because I'm hoping to get just so much information that I'll be able to share it and let you see what I encountered in that visit in particular. And then also, as we get to the green stock factory, that's something I know that you've never seen. I haven't seen anything about that either. So how they do it, why they do it, how it was developed, and I'll be talking to the inventor and his daughter in particular as I make that trip. So yeah, lots of fun stuff to come. It'll just be a question to when I can get them accomplished and put out. So Gene is saying, I have 2 green stalks to play with this year. Good for you. Yeah, when I got my second one, it actually opened the opportunities up to me. Because I've been doing the easy way with the lettuces and the spinach and all those salad crops. That's what I was focused on. But once I got the second one, my second one right now is a strawberry tower. And you'll see more of that in the months ahead too, because I'm filming the progress of that. But I have a whole green stock tower now with 32 strawberry plants growing in it, and just outside my door. So I think that's going to be a lot of fun as well. So good for you. 2 can give you a lot of options and really allow you to grow plants using that system in an area. And so let's tie this back to the microclimate idea. And so when you're using a green stock, because it's circular, the entire tower does not get the same amount of sun except at the height of summer. And so particularly in early season and late season, one side of that tower is going to get less sunlight than the other. And so what I've done is I have the spinner attachment for my green stock, and every 2 days or 3 days I go out and give it a little bit of a turn so that the plants will get all the same amount of light. And so I'm turning the back side to the front side so that one area is not in the shade. But you can do just the opposite. Knowing that the back side of a vertical tower like that is always going to get less sun, you can actually grow tender leafy herbs, tender lettuces in that back side that might be harmed by a full day's sun, or might bolt if they get exposed to that heat and sun. So we've been talking a lot about the green stock today. Even with the green stock are the opportunities for creating microclimates and planting accordingly within that same tower. And then also because mine are on wheels, so I can move them around, same idea. I can move the whole system closer to the house to get more shade or farther away from the house to get more sun. So in spring, when there is lower light and I don't have as long a day on my deck, I can push the green stalk into the sun to get more sunlight than it would in another location. And that's one of the advantages of portable container gardening, is that you can move the containers around to take advantage of the extra sunlight or less sunlight or whatever that particular plant needs. And so that's the idea of microclimates. Don't think if you get any container system set up, especially a green stalk, that once it's in place, it needs to stay in that spot. No, move it around. Move it around to take advantage of the changing patterns of weather and sun in other areas of your yard. So perfect opportunity. So Suffolk Shepherd, nice to see you here on Monday. I must move some blackberry plants in my garden to another location in zone 7A. What month would you move them if it was you? So if it was me, I would move them in early spring, as soon as the soil can be worked. One of the things, and I've done this with raspberries many times over many years. The plant, both the blackberry and the raspberries, will start growing underneath the surface long before you see any growth start to appear. And so as soon as the soil thaws, and so in zone 7A, that's probably going to be happening here pretty soon. As soon as the soil thaws, if you start digging out some of those plants, you're probably going to see some new growth. Some of the new canes that are still underground are going to be white when you dig them up. You might actually see some leaves that are just starting to break the surface of the soil. But those plants are going to be alive and active. And one of the reasons that you want to do that earlier rather than later is because a full-size blackberry cane just really doesn't transplant well. When you dig up the plants and move them, you're going to end up damaging some of the roots. And so an actively growing plant won't do as well when you damage the roots. But if you can catch it when it's still small, if you can catch it just as it's breaking dormancy, or ideally while it's still dormant, you should have better success with the transplanting. And so I grew raspberries at the Galileo School Garden. All of those raspberries came from my home garden, and that's what I did. In early spring, I dug up the raspberries as soon as I could dig in the soil. I put them into pots and then took them to the school and waited till the plants actually started growing so that I didn't plant any dead plants, because there's no reason to plant a dead plant. So I do like to wait to see that sprout so I know it's actively growing. And then I transplanted those young raspberry plants into the school garden, and they just took off. They just did crazy. I have tried, because often, particularly with the brambles, they'll start spreading, and if they start spreading into a pathway, it's better to get to them early, dig them up as soon as they get into the path so that they don't overtake the path. So I have tried later in the season digging up some of those raspberry plants that work their way into the path, and then doing the same thing, potting them up and then trying to transplant them in the fall. It works, but it doesn't work as successfully. And so in the spring, I'll dig up and pot up 10 raspberry plants, and I'll get 10 raspberry plants. But if I do that later in the summer or in early fall, I'll dig up 10, and I'll be lucky if 5 of them actually develop into a full cane the next year. So hope that helps. It's generally the springtime for a lot of the plants that we want to transplant in our garden. Catch them when they're small, because even if they have some root damage, while they're still small, it's not going to be as big an impact on the plant. And so the plant that would normally, if it was left in the same location, would be putting energy into growing new leaves and a new cane. Well, now it devotes energy into sending out the roots it needs to support the leaves and the cane that might already be on the plant or that it's about ready to start growing. And so you tend to get better root development in the spring as well, because that's the time that the plant is figuring out where the energy needs to go and how big it's going to grow. Okay, I'm scrolling down to see what I missed. There's Nick from Yuma. Happy Monday to you. Can you do a surprise live stream during your trip? Well, actually, that's not a bad idea. So I won't promise that, but I actually hadn't thought about that. I may be able to do a quick live stream, depending on the internet and the bandwidth and all of the rest of that. So yes, it would be a surprise live stream. So no promises, but 2 weeks from today on the 28th, if I can, I'll pop on and do a quick live stream, and I'll tell you about what's happened so far with my visit to the Baker Creek heirloom seeds and to the green stock. So thank you for that contribution, and thanks for suggesting that. I haven't done a live stream on the road before, so this might be something new to try. I'll see if I can figure it out between now and then we'll see what's happening on that Monday. So if you're around, go ahead and check it out. And if I have it figured out of how I'm going to do it, I'll do like I normally do, where I'll set everything up and all you have to do is click on the link. If it doesn't work as planned and it does become an actual just surprise spur of the moment thing, then you might have to look on your home page and look through your feed and see if maybe I'm popping up. So interesting idea. You've actually got me thinking about something at this point that I hadn't thought about. That's a great idea. So LP's asking, any advice on moving a 6-year-old fruit tree, still small, building a greenhouse like yours, and they are in the best spot for it? And so I have moved young fruit trees before. I moved a couple of apple trees a number of years back. The idea is to try to dig out as much of the root as possible, or root system as possible, and leaving the soil around those roots, trying to not disrupt the root growth and not damage the roots. The easiest way I've found, well, it's not necessarily easy, but take a tarp or some big canvas material, something that's strong enough that you can lay down next to where you're digging up the tree. Dig it up with as much soil as you can, and it's going to weigh quite a bit if you leave all that soil on. And then just lift it up onto that tarp, and then you drag the tarp to wherever it is that you're going to put it into the new hole, and then you plant it into the new hole. This also works best when the tree is dormant. So do it if you can work in the soil, if you can dig down deep enough to try to get as many roots as possible. You may start seeing that the buds are starting to burst. That's about the time that you want to be doing it. If you do it when the tree is actively growing with lots of leaves, then the tree's going to suffer because you're going to damage some of those roots. And now the roots probably don't have enough energy to support the tree. The tree will probably survive for another year or two, but may not survive after that. So try to do it while it's dormant. Try to get as many of the roots as possible. Drag the tree. Don't try to yank the tree and carry the tree by the trunk, because the weight of the soil might actually damage the trunk and any other branches. Just drag it across the yard, and hopefully that will work for you. It's worked for me before. The tree will take some time to recover. And so it's one of those things that I had that the apple trees I did were young, and they had just fruited the year before, and so they were about at that 5 or 6 year point. Then I dug them up and moved them, and it took, I think, 2 years before I saw fruit again, because the next year the tree was putting its energy into still developing the roots that it had lost and new branches, and so it wasn't putting energy into the fruit in that subsequent year. So do anticipate that you may set yourself back a little bit as far as the fruit production on the tree. Okay, let's see. K&C Mystic Mountain Morph says, I can't seem to find a bag of peat moss in my area, but I have a lot of peat moss seed starters. Okay. And so not sure where you're at in particular, but most of our peat moss in the United States comes from Canada. In fact, almost all of it. You might be able to find some peat from other areas, but almost all of it is going to be Canadian peat. And at least in the news this last week, the supply line from Canada to the United States is essentially shut down, and it's going to take a while for it to build back up again. So that could explain this time of year for people that are seeking peat moss. They bought it all out and it's not being replenished because the trucks aren't coming across the border from Canada with all that peat moss. So I hadn't really thought about that, but if you see those kind of things in your store and you were thinking about getting a bag of peat moss and you see a bag of peat moss, you might want to pick up that bag of peat moss, because once it's gone, it might be months before it's replenished, just because of the supply situation that's happened between Canada and the United States in the last couple weeks. So that might be an explanation for it. And Melissa's saying that she's purchased peat moss from Amazon before. It is pricier if you get it from Amazon, but it could be a fallback if you absolutely need it and have to have it. I prefer to buy the big bales and use them when I use them, and so I'll get them ahead of time. But now's the time to act if you're looking for that. So and I agree completely with you, Jay. I've got a video where I talk about this, an older video. I've been thinking about redoing it actually to update some information on it. The border is reopened today. Supplies are moving, and for those of you that don't think peat moss is something you should be using, that does hold true in many regions of the world. There are areas where peat bogs in Europe have been devastated and they're in decline, and it's not done sustainably. But especially in Canada, it's a sustainable, harvestable material. It's really not much different than any other big crop that's being grown in either Canada or the United States. It just happens to be peat that comes from a bog, and there are millions and millions of acres of the peat bogs in Canada, and the way they're harvesting and the way that they are replanting the bogs is completely sustainable. And so I completely, and Jay from Canada knows probably a little bit more than the rest of us, but you're exactly right. I use peat because I live in the United States. If I lived in another country, I might not use it. Now, Russian peat bogs also have very similar characteristics to the Canadian bogs, and the Russian industry, as I understand it, is working to develop the same kind of sustainable practices. So in Europe, if you've got access to the Russian peat moss, it's effectively the same. It's a sustainable product. But for other areas of the world, that's why cocoa coir is becoming so prevalent, because you can't find peat and it's not available. But I'll continue to use it here in the States just because it is less expensive for me than the cocoa coir, and except maybe right now, it's easy to find and something that is really easy to use in the garden. So, okay, let's see. Bettina says it's a managed resource here. So there you go. It definitely is a managed product. So, okay, I'm going to see if there's anything else. I'm trying to catch up. So Tanya's saying, what is a good bagged compost? I don't have enough to set up my green stock. And so I honestly don't buy any particular brands of compost. So when I look for a compost, I look at at the bag and if it's identified with what's in it, and I use that to help me figure it out. And so in my recent video where I was talking about the seed starter mix and the planting mix, making those, I mentioned a little bit about looking at the bag and the ingredients and what some of that means. That's how I choose my compost, is based on what the ingredients are in that compost. Because sometimes it's composted animal manure, sometimes it's composted wood products, sometimes it's, there's one bag that I actually have had some good success with, that it's poultry manure, basically chicken manure and probably turkey manure along with the feathers, and that's what is in the compost bag. So it depends. I've also bought bags of compost that when you open it up, it's really just a bunch of wood chips, and I don't like those materials. So I'm not sure what's available in all areas. That's another reason why I don't really recommend a specific brand, because I don't know what's available everywhere. But look at the ingredients, see if it's something that matches with what you're looking for. Buy a bag, open it up, see if the material inside is light and fluffy or hard and chunky, and that'll help influence whether you buy that brand again or not. But yeah, setting up the green stock is one of those, with any container system, you got to start putting the soil in at some point, the potting mix. And if you're making it yourself, you got to get the individual components, or you can buy it all ready to go with a big name brand where they have the compost and they have the peat and they have the fertilizer and they have all the other stuff already blended together. That's another option you can do if you want to do containers and green stock. Okay, Mayday Garden. Oh, you just flipped out of sight. Let me scroll back up to see what you were saying. I look for the OMRI seal on bags of compost when I buy it. Same for bagged potting soil. Oh, that's a good suggestion too. So in many areas, at least I know in the United States, there are regulations, and for a lot of these bagged garden materials, you will see different seals and different levels, and often you'll pay for it as well, as to the quality of that product. There are other things that we might buy, and garden soil or top soil often falls into this category. So here in the United States, ingredients or bags of compost are regulated, but bags of topsoil are not. And that's why we've talked about this before, some of the horror stories of what you can find in a bag of potting soil, because they're not potting soil, in a bag of topsoil, because there's no regulations around topsoil. And so they can put anything in it, bag it up and sell it. But there are guidelines when it comes to some of the ingredients that we're using in the garden that are labeled as a potting soil or potting mix or compost. And so you can find organic mixes that are definitely, look for that seal on them to identify that it's an organic material and it's been certified as such. So that's a good thing to point out, that if you're looking for specifics in the quality, you can find some of those by looking at the seal on the bag that shows that it has met some of those regulatory guidelines to be able to match what you want, and then you buy it and put it in your garden. So always an option that you want to do. Okay, let's do Heidi Clark. Always nice to have you here. And yeah, it looks like, RK, if you're coming on late, this is my landscape. And so I talked a little bit about the microclimates in this. And so let's go ahead and finish talking about the microclimates using my yard as an example. And so thank you for pointing that out, Heidi. The greenhouse actually has 3 and potentially 5 microclimates just because of this structure. So inside the greenhouse is a microclimate, unlike any other section of my garden. The front side of the greenhouse, this faces south, so this gets full sun. that area is going to be warmer than any other garden in my area, or any other area of my garden except the greenhouse, because the soil in that space gets the residual heat from the greenhouse. So the soil in the greenhouse is going to be warm. That heat is going to seep out underneath the greenhouse and warm up the soil all the way around. So the front of my greenhouse will be warmer, plus, as you can see, there's some reflective light that will warm up that space as well. The back side of the greenhouse won't ever get full sun. Now, it'll get some of that heat from the soil, but it's going to be in partial sun, because the only light it's going to get is what shines through the greenhouse. And as you'll see in a future video, I'm actually going to put reflective barrier on the north side of my greenhouse. So that side won't get much sunlight at all. It'll just get diffused light through the day. And so that's the one area of my garden where I can grow shade plants, because it'll be diffused light, it'll be warm enough to grow, and it's shaded. Whereas the other areas that I have, like over by my garage, it's just so cold and so out of the way on that north side that I'm not going to be growing any shade plants there. But I can on my greenhouse. And then the same with the sides where the doors are. This side gets full sun from early afternoon to the evening, but it doesn't get any morning sun. The other side is the same way. It gets full morning sun and the beginning of the afternoon sun, and then it's going to be shaded out the rest of the day. So you can see how one structure can create so many different environments around it. And so anticipate that. Something like this little barrel that I'm using here that I'll be growing, I'll be putting a post in there and growing some vertical plants. Same kind of thing. It just around that little container, the front side will be in full sun all day long. The back side will get partial sun depending on the time of day. And then the soil within that container will be different still. And especially if I'm growing a vertical plant up this, it's going to cast shade on the backside. So maybe I can extend some of my shade garden to grow those individual plants behind that. And so those are the kind of things that to think about as you're developing your landscape and figuring out what the microclimates are. On the back side here, that's bird netting that I have over my fruit trees. And so they're covered with frost and snow on this particular morning. But because of the deer that roam through, and because of Mala, who actually likes to chew on trees, I've got the trees covered with with the bird netting. And so that they extend. I've got trees back here all the way to tree right there. So as those trees grow, they're actually going to shade that whole area. Right now, that whole area is in full sunlight. But by putting fruit trees on that part of my landscape in that garden area, I'm creating a new microclimate. And it's going to take years for it to develop. And so every year, that area will be a little bit different. As those trees grow and begin to cast shade, it's going to influence the plants that do well underneath those trees until they reach the point when those trees are full grown and a lot of shade in the summertime. And then I'll be probably putting in different plants than I'm putting in right now. So microclimates aren't necessarily today it's one thing and tomorrow it's another thing. With something like trees, it changes over a period of time as well. And it's one of those things you got to keep track of and maybe modify the plants that you're growing. Pulling out plants that may have grown well in one year and moving them to another area and putting in new plants because the microclimate has changed because the plants that are growing in that area have changed. So something to think about along those lines. Now, so I mentioned earlier the video I did on Saturday where I planted the purple garden, and that's what I want to encourage you to do in your garden this year. Is not necessarily the color challenge, but one of the reasons I'm doing that is because it's fun. It's really a great way to get my granddaughters into the garden And they love it when they're in the garden looking at the bugs and harvesting all of the vegetables and the fruit. And I love it because they're loving it. And so the purple garden is just a way to add fun to the garden because my granddaughters add fun to the garden. But it doesn't have to be a color garden. I'm encouraging you for the next season that you're growing in to add something to the garden specifically for fun, for enjoyment. Doesn't have to do anything with whether you eat it or not, whether you can harvest or not, whether you're going to cut the flowers or not, whether you're saving the seed or not. None of that matters. Grow something, build something, put something in your garden just for fun. I've got my peacock here. I love my peacock. I've had my peacock in a number of gardens over the last few years. I think I've had it for at least 10 years now. And I love my peacock. That adds some fun to the garden. And when I see it bobbing up and down in the wind, and you can see that in some of my videos, it just warms my heart to see my little peacock alive in the garden. And that's what I'm talking about. It could be a structure, it could be a piece of art, it can be a plant, it can be whatever you want it to be. But have something in your garden just for fun, just for the enjoyment factor. Whether it influences a microclimate or not doesn't matter. What it should influence is you, so that when you go out to the garden and you see whatever that thing is that you're doing for fun, you can stop and just go, oh, yeah, that made my day. I love seeing my peacock pounce its little beak into the ground on a really windy day. That's fun. It looks like it's alive. Find those kind of things for your garden and just have fun with it. And it could be a white garden. It could be a purple garden. It could be a single plant that's growing incredible flowers. Just do it. Find whatever that one thing is to do this year. And the next year, add to it and do something else. And the year after that, add to it and do something else. And that means everywhere you go in your garden, it's just going to be fun. It's going to be something that makes it a place to visit for you and for everybody else. So join me back here next week for a special show and a special guest. And it'll be a really nice show. We'll be talking about compost in addition to a lot of other fun topics. So look forward to seeing you here, same time, same place, next Monday. Hope you have a great gardening week and enjoy all the time you have together, and especially enjoy gardening. I'm Gardener Scott. See you then.